All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this, if you're in mid-Missouri, sort of like dark and stormy night that we're having here. I do want to say that Trisha and I are both co-hosting this, and hopefully we won't have a situation where both of our internets go out at the same time. We're about an hour apart, so we should be okay. So for folks that aren't as familiar with Zoom, you are right now in a webinar, which means that you can see and hear Trisha and I, but we cannot see or hear you, and your other fellow attendees cannot see or hear you either. But please do communicate with us and with each other in the chat. Once you click on the chat, you can either select just panelists, so just send messages to us, or you can chat with everyone, panelists and attendees. And so if you're adding some, information or, a question that you think everyone might want to see, please do think about using panelists and attendees. Although we're also happy to read those comments for you if you like. And then you can also use the Q&A box. This is a great place to put in specific questions for Trisha as she goes along, because they're a little bit easier to kind of keep track of if they're in the Q&A box. But feel free to use either. So I'm Dana with the Missouri River Bird Observatory. Our mission is the conservation of birds and all wildlife really, and their habitats as well via science, education, and advocacy. This is the third in our Missouri River series, and some folks join us quite a bit, and you know that we've done many webinars. And for our last series before next fall, when we start up again, we wanted to do a series on our namesake and where we came from. So this picture is actually the Missouri River at Grand Pass Conservation Area here in Saline County, where we got our start. I did want to mention, because we just launched registration for it's the second annual Birds and Bees Festival. So this is our website. This is just our homepage at mrbo.org. You can go here and you can click this button right here, Birds and Bees Festival, and you can get to the event agenda and see all the exhibitors and speakers. We have some really good programs. It is a hybrid event, so it is partially virtual and partially in person in Arrow Rock, our hometown. And so folks can join from anywhere. I think we have almost 30 presentations right now from a variety of different awesome people, biologists, master naturalists, woodworkers that build houses for birds, all kinds of different really super cool nature related topics. So I encourage you to check that out. And now I am very pleased to introduce our friend Trisha Crabill. You can see her here with, I think, a spotted salamander. Am I correct?
Yep. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Trisha received her bachelor's in science in biology at Harding University in Arkansas and an MS in biological sciences from Towson University, which is in Maryland. She has been 12 years with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and her job is implementing various provisions of the Endangered Species Act. So she's a great person for our topic this evening. She works on a variety of species, but her emphasis is actually on amphibians and reptiles. So with that, Trisha, I'm going to stop sharing. I think that worked. Go ahead and turn it over to you, and I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A while you have your screen share up.
Okay. And I did note Ethan's request to use Latin names throughout the presentation. And I'm sorry to say that I will be using common names primarily. Life in a government job. So
he's just here to make sure.
Thanks for the introduction, Dana. And like Dana said, if anyone has questions as we go along, please put them in the chat so that we can answer them when we get to the end, or perhaps Dana will even pose them while we're going through the presentation. And as Dana mentioned, my expertise is in the conservation of amphibians and reptiles. That's something I've been really passionate about for ever since I was young. And so it's really nice to be in a position now where I can actively work on that. And it's not just amphibians and reptiles that I work on, though. In our office, we tend to work on a variety of different species. And so I've got the lead for several crayfish species, as well as fish species, and then amphibian and reptile species as well. And I will admit that the 3 species we'll be talking about today are not species for which I have the lead in our office for, so I'm not as familiar with them. So if you have some specific questions about their life history or recovery efforts, I may have to follow up with answers to those questions later. So to start off with, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Fish and Wildlife Service in case not everyone is familiar with what our agency does. So our mission is to work with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. So there's an emphasis on working with partners, and there's also an emphasis on having our efforts benefit the American people. And as you can see on the right side of the slide, our agency has been around for a little over 150 years. So the ways that we achieve this mission is by protecting and recovering threatened and endangered species, monitoring and managing migratory birds, restoring nationally significant fisheries. So we do that through fish hatcheries and other fisheries efforts, enforcing federal wildlife laws and regulating international wildlife trade, conserving and restoring fish and wildlife habitat, managing and distributing funds to states, territories, and tribes for fish and wildlife conservation, helping foreign governments conserve wildlife through international conservation efforts, and fulfilling our federal tribal trust responsibilities. And so many of you may already be familiar with the Big Muddy National Refuge. So that refuge has several units along the Missouri River. And so they actually fulfill several of their responsibilities as that refuge. And this evening, I'll be focusing on protecting and recovering threatened and endangered species, specifically those associated with the Missouri River. To better understand how we accomplish that, I thought I'd go over some helpful or some relevant aspects of the Endangered Species Act, since that's the authority under which we conduct our work on imperiled species. So all of the sections of the ESA are relevant to protecting and recovering species, but I'll talk about those that are pertain to listing and recovery. So what is the process of listing species? There's 2 avenues by which we can list a species. The first is if the service preemptively initiates an assessment of the species status to determine if it warrants listing. And that's usually if we already have information about the species and we're concerned about its status. And then there's a second option where there's a citizen provision of the Endangered Species Act where people or organizations can actually petition the service to list a species. And so whichever of those avenues happens, we usually end up conducting what we refer to as a species status assessment. So a species status assessment is used to evaluate the species viability and to help determine if the species meets the definition of threatened or endangered. So the definition of endangered is in danger of extinction, whereas the definition of threatened is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. And I'll back up and say about species status assessments, that's not something that we always did when we evaluated the status of the species. That's something new that's been developed since 2010 as part of an effort to improve how our agency implements the Endangered Species Act. And so with species status assessments, the goal is to provide a more objective way to evaluate the status of species, because before, sometimes those evaluations could be somewhat subjective. So if we find a species warrants listing, then we develop a proposal to list the species. And at the same time, we also determine if it's appropriate to designate critical habitat. And critical habitat is specific areas containing features essential to the conservation of a species. And so examples of that may be a certain soil type, certain flow velocities or stream depth, or other physical or biological features that are necessary to support a species. And then I'd also like to note that for listing decisions, as well as other aspects of the Endangered Species Act, decisions are based on the best available scientific and commercial information. And so that means even if we don't have published literature available, which is always preferred, we use the best information we have at hand. So sometimes that's gray literature, such as agency reports. Sometimes it's unpublished data by researchers. And all of that is really important to helping make our decisions. As for recovering listed species, one of the first things that we do once a species is listed is we develop a recovery plan. The recovery plan outlines the strategy for recovery. It also identifies criteria for achieving recovery. So what the species status may look like in terms of population trends or population numbers. And then the recovery plans also identify recovery actions, as well as the estimated time and cost of recovery for a species. And while the service has oversight responsibility for implementing recovery plans, we don't actually perform or fund all of those tasks ourselves. We rely largely on partners, such as federal agencies. In Missouri, we work a lot with the Mark Twain National Forest Service and the Park Service. We also work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And then we work extensively with state fish and wildlife agencies like the Missouri Department of Conservation, as well as county and local governments, and then also conservation organizations and other NGOs, such as zoos and the Missouri River Bird Observatory. And then we also work with corporations, universities, and private landowners. And working with private landowners is really important because there's a lot of species for which the majority of their range occurs in private land. And so when you're talking about where you're going to be able to make the most difference, sometimes that ends up being on private land. And so there's various programs that we can use to work with landowners to help incentivize them to implement different efforts that would benefit listed species. Another important tool of the ESA is the responsibility that federal agencies are tasked with. Federal agencies are directed under Section 7 of the ESA to conduct programs for the conservation of endangered and threatened species. And so what this is proactive programs that federal agencies undertake to help conserve listed species. And then another part of Section 7 under the ESA, and this is a really important part, is it requires agencies to ensure that actions they authorize, fund, or carry out are not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of listed species or adversely modify critical habitat. To ensure that, federal agencies evaluate potential impacts of their projects on listed species and critical habitat. And so that pertains to, like I said on the slide before, any action, federal action, including permitting, implementation by a federal agency, or funding of by a federal agency. So if an agency action may affect a listed species or critical habitat, they must consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service to evaluate those effects. And as part of that consultation, we work with them to avoid or minimize effects to the species. And so examples of that include clearing trees during the winter so that bats that roost under the bark of trees aren't impacted by tree removal during the active season. We also have measures for certain species, certain aquatic species, where we recommend that in-stream projects occur outside of their breeding season so that the species aren't likely to be impacted, or at least their breeding isn't likely to be impacted. And federal agencies are motivated to avoid adverse effects, not just because they voluntarily want to conserve species, but also because if there are going to be adverse effects to listed species, they have to go through a process referred to as formal consultation. And I won't go into the details of what that entails, but it's a fairly lengthy and paperwork heavy process. So lastly, another way that listed species are protected through the Endangered Species Act is by the prohibitions that are outlined under Section 9. And basically that section just identifies a list of things that you can't do with a listed species unless you've got some kind of permit or authorization. And so examples are importing or exporting, take under a variety of conditions, possession, sale, delivery, any of those things that you don't really want to do with the listed species unless you have a permit. And as I mentioned, there are some exemptions, such as when an appropriate permit is acquired, such as a recovery permit to conduct research or an interstate commerce permit to transport listed species across state lines. Zoos frequently use those to transport listed species they use in their conservation programs. So there's certainly instances where there are exceptions or exemptions to those take prohibitions. So going back to the term take that I used previously, take is defined in the ESA as to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture or collect, or attempt to engage in any such conduct. So again, all things that you don't want to do with an listed species. And then the term harm, which is used in the definition of take, is further defined as any act which actually kills or injures fish or wildlife. And that can include significant habitat modification or degradation if it significantly impairs essential behavioral patterns of fish or wildlife. So it's not just that the species is injured or killed. If their habitat is modified such that their survivorship or reproduction is impacted, then that's also considered take. So with that background, we can shift gears and talk about 3 species associated with the Missouri River: the Pallid Sturgeon, piping plover, and Interior Least Tern. We'll start with the Pallid Sturgeon. Pallid sturgeons inhabit the Missouri and Mississippi rivers and some of their tributaries from Montana to Louisiana. And the species historically occurred in over 3,500 river miles. And you can see on the map to the right, the red depicts areas that were historically occupied. And so that's a pretty large range. Pallid sturgeons are bottom dwelling and primarily use main channels, secondary channels, and channel border habitats in large rivers. And so channel border habitats are areas around the main channels themselves. And they're a long-lived species, and they can live up to 60 years old and perhaps longer. And their diet generally is composed of fish and aquatic insect larvae. Primary threats to the Pallid sturgeon include large river habitat alterations, including river channelization, impoundments, and altered flow regimes. And altered flow regimes are caused by releases at the dam and then impounded water behind the dams. Additional threats include degraded water quality and then entrainment, which is passage of fish through the hydroelectric dams when it results in injury or death. So the entrainment doesn't pertain to intentional fish passage with ladders and other methods. It's the unintentional passage of the fish in a way that's injurious to them. So as a result of these threats and declines in population numbers, the Pallid sturgeon was listed as endangered in 1990. So the historical range of the species is on the left, and then the map on the right is the current range of the species. And I apologize, these figures ended up being a little blurry, but you can see that there's a substantial reducement in the areas that are occupied, so those red areas. And then within the red areas where the species still occurs, the abundance has been greatly reduced. Recovery efforts for the species have focused on conducting population monitoring to track changes in abundance and status, conducting habitat restoration efforts such as creating side channel habitats, restoring connectivity to backwater areas, notching dikes, providing fish passage, and manipulating flows through the dams. And then another important recovery effort is the captive propagation and augmentation efforts, or I should say the head starting efforts. So eggs are collected from females and then fertilized with sperm. And then the resulting young, once they hatch out of the eggs, those are head started in captive propagation facilities. And then they're released into the wild. And so by raising the young to certain life stages, they have a much higher survivorship than they would otherwise have in the wild had they not been head started. And so that's an important way that they've been continuing to maintain the species in the wild. So what's the current status of the pallid sturgeon? Well, data regarding recruitment, mortality, habitat use, and abundance remain limited. Numbers of individuals collected in some rivers are higher, and there's evidence of limited recruitment. However, species experts think that the increase in observations is due to increased monitoring efforts and improvements in sampling techniques rather than an actual increase in individuals in the wild. The good news is that the augmentation program is ongoing and appears to be successful in maintaining the species presence within the Missouri River Basin. But unfortunately, species experts in the service have concluded that if augmentation efforts were to cease, at least right now, the species would once again face local extirpation within several river reaches. So with all of this considered, it's likely that the pallid sturgeon will remain listed for a while. All right, so now we'll move on to the piping plover. And Ethan, I apologize, I'm not even going to attempt to say the Latin names here. So perhaps you can relay them at the end. So the piping plover is considered to have three populations. The population on the west is the northern Great Plains population, and it's listed as threatened. The population on the top right is the Great Lakes population, and it's listed as endangered. And then the population on the east is the Atlantic coast population, and it's listed as threatened. And then down at the lower portion of the map in orange is the winter range of the species. And I should also note, so the Atlantic coast population is actually a different subspecies than the two other populations. But because these populations are all separate from each other and have some differences in terms of the threats and management, their status was individually evaluated. So that's why each of them is considered separately. Piping plovers, and I'll just discuss the northern, let me go back a slide. So it's this northern Great Plains population is where the species occupies the shorelines around the Missouri River. So I'll just be discussing that population. And that population, the individuals breed along rivers and reservoirs in Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana. And then they nest on alkaline or naturally salty lakes in South Dakota and Montana, and on sand and gravel mines in Nebraska. The male will create a shallow depression on the ground with both, which both adults line with small pebbles, and then both adults share incubation duties. Piping plovers forage by gleaning invertebrates from the substrate or by running and pecking on the substrate with short runs between pecks. And their migration is not well defined, and they appear to use sites opportunistically and therefore do not have regularly used stopover sites in the central portion of the country, which is likely why we don't have many records in Missouri, or at least why I was not able to find any records in Missouri. Although if anyone has information about records in Missouri, I'd be interested to hear about it at the end of the presentation. So the primary threat to piping plovers is changes in the quality and quantity of riverine habitat, which is due mostly to damming and water withdrawals. So this reduces the amount of sandy shoreline for nesting, and then water releases can flood downstream areas. As a result of these impacts, the Northern Great Plains and Atlantic coastal populations were listed as threatened in 1986, and then the Great Lakes population was listed as endangered. Efforts to recover the piping plover have focused on regulatory protections such as designation of critical habitat. We discussed what critical habitat was earlier, which is the features were essential to support a species in a certain area. Other regulatory protections include interagency coordination between the service and federal agencies on designing federal projects. So this is that Section 7 consultation component. And then prohibitions against harassment. So piping plovers get either intentionally or incidentally disturbed by people and pets on the beach. And so that's one area where the regulatory protections are important. So other recovery efforts have focused on surveys and monitoring, habitat and restoration, nest protection and predator control, and outreach. And so some of the outreach has included coordinating with local and state government, including local zoning and community planning boards. And so that's been important to help minimize or avoid development within areas occupied by the piping plover. And then there's additional outreach to younger folks as well as people in the communities. So given these recovery efforts, what's the current status of the piping plover? Well, numbers have increased in each of the populations, as have annual fledgling rates, and successful nesting is being documented in new locations. However, most threats, including habitat degradation, predation, and human disturbance, remain persistent and pervasive, unfortunately. And so in the last review of the species status conducted in 2016, the service concluded that ongoing efforts are needed to maintain and ensure growth within the populations. So the species isn't ready to be delisted. So the last species I wanted to talk about is the Interior Least Tern. The historical range of the Interior Least Tern included the Missouri and Mississippi rivers and major tributaries. And as far as the life history, least terns are the smallest members of the tern family. They're relatively long-lived and can live over 20 years. They're migratory, nesting along freshwater habitats of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, somewhat similar to the piping plover. And they're major tributary, nesting along freshwater habitats of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers and their major tributaries. And then the Interior Least Tern overwintering is in the Caribbean and South America. They nest along sand and gravel bars, and they feed primarily on small fish. Similar to the piping plover, the primary threat to the Interior Least Tern is the construction of dams or other forms of river modifications that alter water flow regimes and subsequently inundate and destroy nesting habitat. The alteration of flow regimes has resulted in low numbers of surviving birds throughout the range. And as a result, the Interior Least Tern was listed as endangered in 1985. Recovery efforts have focused on monitoring populations, improving nesting areas with dredge material, controlling vegetation and predators, protecting nesting areas, and improving water flow. And I don't have it on this slide, but recovery efforts also focus on outreach to avoid and minimize disturbance to nesting habitat. As a result of these efforts, there's been a positive population trend range-wide for the Interior Least Tern, with the current number of individuals estimated to be 18,000 birds. They currently nest along more than 2,800 miles of river channels along the Great Plains and Lower Mississippi Valley. And many actions beneficial actions have become standard practices and will continue to be implemented, and thus helping to continue to conserve the species. So as a result, the Interior Least Tern was delisted in January of this year and is now considered one of the ESA success stories. So that's exciting because it's not very often that we get to recover species. So we talked about some of the listed species associated with the Missouri River, and I thought it would be interesting to also see some of the species associated with the Missouri River tributaries. So the Eastern Hellbender occurs in several tributaries to the Missouri River, including the Niagara River, Gasconade River, and Merrimack River, although technically the Merrimack flows into the Mississippi. And I say it's endangered in Missouri. The endangered listing will become effective on April 9th. So we're almost there. And this species was listed in Missouri because of impacts from sedimentation. Mainly it was because of drastic population declines, and we're still not sure exactly what is causing those declines, but we think it's probably sedimentation, and then it may also be from amphibian chytrid fungus, which Eastern Hellbenders have. And then other species, listed species in the Missouri River tributaries include the spectacle case, snuffbox, scale shell, sheepnose, and pink mucket. And all of these are listed as endangered and are also impacted by excessive sedimentation in the rivers in which they occur. And there's also terrestrial species such as the Indiana bat, gray bat, and northern long-eared bat that forage in riparian corridors of the Missouri River, as well as other places in the state and beyond. So wanted to thank you for letting me share your time this evening. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Trisha, it looks like we've got 3 questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
The first one is about how many Pallid Sturgeon are released from the hatcheries each year that are doing conservation work.
That's a really good question. I can guess at that. I know it's a lot. Whenever they release fish, it's to the tune of thousands of individuals. And so those are usually young fry that are released. They may also be releasing larger size classes, but I expect it's to the tune of thousands. And I did put this link here in case I couldn't answer any questions, where you can also go and there's a search menu for listed species if you'd like to go to the species profiles to find out more about some of these species. And I will say, along the lines of Pallid Sturgeon, and I've gone out with fisheries biologists in our office. So we have a program that used to extensively sample Pallid Sturgeon in the Missouri River. And most of the Pallid Sturgeon that they would capture are actually captive reared individuals and not the product of breeding in the wild. So it's good that the propagation is helping, but ideally we'd like to see more wild reproduction happening to sustain the populations.
I put a link in the chat that I had found when I was looking into the sturgeon, and it doesn't seem to be very like well-known information exactly how many. And I suspect that's what you said, Trisha. Like, I mean, they're talking hundreds of thousands of eggs, up to a couple million eggs, and then releases in the thousands. So there's an article in the chat about that too.
And that's consistent with what I had read about their assessments, is that they can estimate population numbers for certain reaches of the stream, but they can't do that throughout the entire range. So it's largely uncertain what the actual numbers are.
Our next question is, what preys on piping plover?
So they have, I hate to admit it, but snakes do. Snakes can actually get in through some of the fencing that they have. I think it's probably a lot of the predators that you would expect for eggs, you know, so raccoons, foxes, I would expect otters, or, you know, any of those kind of animals that are opportunistic feeders to eat the eggs when they get the chance.
I'd like to take the opportunity to mention feral and outdoor cats as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So this is a neat ecological one. Explain how dams hurt nesting areas, please.
Okay. So the dams, it's in a number of ways. So the construction of a dam is going to impound water behind the dam. And so that is going to flood shoreline habitat that would otherwise be available for shorebirds to use. And then downstream of the dam, you know, when water is released from the dam, they're usually doing that to generate power, or they're doing that to control flooding downstream or upstream for that matter. And so the way they release water doesn't usually mimic the natural flow regimes of the river system. So what ends up happening is either, you know, the water is too low, or the water is too high and comes in really quickly and it inundates some of that shoreline habitat that had been exposed before the water is released.
Trisha, who monitors that the Endangered Species Act is actually being followed in Missouri, and does it apply equally to private landowners? I actually kind of had a question about that myself when you were explaining the basics of the ESA.
Yeah, and so if you're talking about implementation by federal agencies, you know, the service is very involved with that. We coordinate extensively with those agencies to make sure they're consulting as they should be. But when you're talking about the overall oversight over how the ESA is being implemented, often we have outside entities like environmental groups that you know, stay abreast of what's happening within the agency. And if they see something where they think that we could improve, or they don't agree with an action that we've taken, then they can question that action. They can take it to court. And sometimes that overturns the decisions. And so, you know, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have that checks and balances of an agency. And so that way, you know, I think all agencies should be accountable to the decisions they're making, and making sure that those are transparent and they're logical decisions. And if that's not happening, then that's good that we have a way to address that. The private land question is a little more difficult because we're not often out there to see what's happening on private land. And we do recognize that private landowners are really important for conserving listed species. And so we, to the extent possible, we really try to make those be positive interactions. But there are times when private landowners do things that can cause impacts to listed species, such as changing a stream channel that has mussels in it, or building a low water crossing where there might be a listed species. And so normally what we try to do is first approach them in a way that we can remedy the problem. And then if they're not open to that, then, you know, we have other, you know, recourses. And that is that take of listed species, whether you're a federal agency or whether you're a private landowner, is still illegal under the Endangered Species Act. So it's very rare that it, you know, it resorts to that, but it can, and we do have federal agencies that can assist with that, or federal agents, I meant.
Trisha, relatedly, when you spoke earlier about whether the service decides to assess the species for listing, or whether it's like a citizen petition, it is my understanding that the citizen petition form often also takes the form of lawsuit. Is that true? Or can anyone petition the service?
Oh, sure. So the answer to that question is anyone can. in order for us to consider that information, you have to have sufficient information to show that the species is experiencing some kind of decline or threats. And so what happens if there is sufficient information? The first step in that process is we make what's called a 90-day finding. And so that's kind of like our course filter to see if there's even enough information to move forward with an evaluation. And so because we've received so many petitions in recent years, often we just go ahead and make what we call a positive 90-day finding, which means then we then put that on the schedule to do a further assessment for that species. And in theory, we're supposed to conduct that assessment within 12 months and publish a decision. But we've received in recent years called mega petitions that have like 300 or 400 species on them. And so we are admittedly backlogged. And so we're not making those deadlines. And so that's when it's usually when our agency gets sued, it's because we don't meet the deadlines that we are required to meet. And, we do get sued on some of the decisions we make if they're considered arbitrary or capricious. And so that's two ways that lawsuits can actually happen. But ideally, when we receive a petition, it won't end up in a lawsuit. We'll go through that evaluation process in a time frame that's acceptable.
So you mentioned the Eastern Hellbender. Someone asks, what about the Ozark Hellbender?
I could talk for days about Hellbenders, but I'll keep it brief. So the Ozark Hellbender was listed in 2011 as endangered. So we've been working extensively with that species. The threats are largely similar. There's a couple of differences. Ozark Hellbenders occur in the southward flowing streams in the Ozarks, and those streams tend to be more spring fed and lower water temperatures. And those water temperatures happen to make it more conducive for amphibian chytrid fungus. So they have a higher prevalence of the amphibian chytrid fungus. And then they also have a really high prevalence of physical abnormalities. And so it's best described as necrotic limbs. And so their toes become and pads of their feet become necrotic. And then that works its way up to where sometimes they're just left with little nubs for appendages. And sometimes they can survive like that, and sometimes they don't. And we're still not sure exactly what's happening that's causing that. We think it may be related to amphibian chytrid fungus because that infects the keratin of amphibian skin. And the keratin is found on the toe pads and the toes. So I'll say that Ozark Hellbenders and Eastern Hellbender populations have both substantially declined, but over 80% in the state, which is why they're listed. The positive news is that we think that we're going to be able to save them. So the St. Louis Zoo has been working passionately with the Missouri Department of Conservation to get a captive propagation program up and running. And so what that consists of is, and this is it's been primarily for Ozark Hellbenders, but they're implementing it for Eastern Hellbenders as well. So it's twofold. MDC will go out and they will search for eggs in the wild, and then they'll collect those eggs and take them to the St. Louis Zoo for captive rearing. And then they'll also look for a healthy brood stock from each of the populations. And so we consider like individual drainages like the Gasconade River or the Nangle River to be separate populations. And so we keep them genetically separated. And so they'll collect brood stock from the relevant populations, and then they'll breed those in captivity. And so that had never been done up until 2011 anywhere in the country with Eastern Hellbenders or Ozark Hellbenders. And in 2011, the zoo had their first successful breeding, and it was really exciting. It was, I think it was over 1,000 fertilized eggs that were produced. And almost every year since, they've had successful breeding. And so what we're able to do is release those young back out into the wild, and we release them at larger size classes so that they have a higher survivorship. And so, we're able to stabilize the populations until we can better identify and address the threats that are contributing to declines. And so we think that recovery for both of those species, or rather subspecies, will take a long time. But we think that we'll be able to eventually get there and save them, which is important because they're just this really cool, unique species. I could talk for days, like I said, but I'll keep it brief.
They're a very, they're species that it's really, really easy to feel affection about. They're really pretty adorable.
I appreciate that, Dana.
I love them. So we have quite a few more questions, Trisha. So
Okay.
If you're willing to hang on, and there a couple are like kind of related. So so a few about sturgeon. So is the sturgeon only in the Missouri River Basin? It did certainly look like that from the range map, right?
It is,
Missouri
yeah.
River Basin and its tributaries. And then why has it not recovered more robustly? And sort of a bit of a related question is, someone asks, and it was actually asked in the context of dams affecting plover nesting, but it's probably just a good overall question that I think is potentially related to the question about the Pallid Sturgeon, which is, you know, someone said they live on the Merrimack and the water level is variable. How is this different than a dam? So I think all of those things are a little bit related ecologically.
Yeah, so the Merrimack, I'll say that even if it has variable water levels, that variability I expect mimics natural variations. You know, it should be natural. It shouldn't really be that impacted by any kind of river modifications. And so species that live in those habitats, they're adapted to those kind of variations in the floodplain. But the impacts to the hydrology that are happening because of dams and channelization, that really exceeds anything beyond what species can really adapt to. I mean, those changes, when you think of the extent of those changes over the length of time that species have been evolving, the species really just don't have an opportunity to evolve to be able to figure out how to go through a dam or how to withstand those river level variations. And so, you know, I think that's largely why we haven't been able to successfully recover some of those large river species. And again, like the Pallid Sturgeon and the piping plover aren't, you know, I don't work with those species. And so I'm just generally familiar with what's going on with those. But, you know, there's only so much habitat restoration you can do when the whole river system is modified. And so I think some of these restoration efforts are important, but some of them are also kind of band-aids to a larger problem. And unfortunately, the service just doesn't, we don't have the regulatory authority to require the removal of dams or, you know, be able to say no to river channelization where, you know, where our regulatory authority really has teeth is when a project is going to cause jeopardy to a species or, you know, jeopardize the continued existence of the species. And that's, you know, that's really the only time we can say, no, you can't conduct that activity. And so really, I think there needs to be a cultural shift in how we use the rivers and what we expect of them. And I think until those changes occur, I think it'll be really difficult to recover something like the Pallid Sturgeon.
Thank you. Someone asks, you mentioned removing vegetation as a task to help plover populations. What type of vegetation? Invasives?
This is where I don't know all the information about piping plovers, unfortunately. I don't know. I would expect invasive vegetation would be an issue. I'm assuming it's any kind of vegetation that would cover the nest, the open area for nesting, or, if the vegetation starts to encroach in those nesting areas, then predators could like more easily sneak into those nests, not be as readily seen by the birds. And so without, I don't know for sure, but that's, my assumptions based on, my understanding.
A question is, how is the number of a species determined? So for delisting, are there surveys?
Oh.
18,000 is a good number for terns, but like, why is 18,000
Right.
good? And
Yeah, like if we had 18,000 Ozark Hellbenders, we would be good. So it's not the number itself that dictates whether a species warrants listing or warrants recovery. It's what those numbers and what the other information indicate about the species viability. And so often we look at the population numbers of a species relative to what their historic numbers were. And then we look at what those population trends are. So if the trends are continuing to go down, then, we look out to the future to ultimately look at whether we think that species is going to become extinct or if they're going to become endangered in the foreseeable future. So we look at the population trends. We also look at what threats are happening, because you could have at a given point in time really great population numbers, but if you've got these new threats on the landscape, then it could be 10 years from now, those population numbers, will really plummet. And so we look at a combination of, what's happening with the population now, and then what we think is going to happen based on the threats in the future. And so, previously I talked a little bit about recovery plans. And so the recovery criteria for that reason are specific for each species, because one population size or population trajectory isn't necessarily going to mean the same thing for another species. So really good questions, Dana.
Yeah, these are great. How prevalent is poaching sturgeon for their roe? And I remember an interesting situation a few years ago here in Missouri with a sting operation that involved the state of New Jersey.
Yeah,
I believe.
I don't know that it's all that prevalent, because frankly, the pallid sturgeon aren't that easy to catch anymore. But I do know it's an active enough threat that it continues to be monitored by our agents.
Let's see. I do want to mention that Ashley, Fish and Wildlife intern, mentioned in the chat that some species of plants release chemicals that the birds will not nest within a certain vicinity to, in terms of piping plovers. Thank you, Ashley.
That's interesting. Thanks for adding that, Ashley.
Yeah. Well, let's do this question first. It's a great one. And it's another like probably 5-month conversation, but what efforts are being made to improve and enlarge the riparian corridor along the Missouri and Mississippi rivers and their tributaries?
Okay, that's a good question. So the low-hanging fruit on that one is we've got the establishment of various units of the Big Muddy Refuge along a good portion of the Missouri River in Missouri. And so certainly that's protecting, revegetating and protecting those riparian areas. And then the service works with other agencies like the Natural Resource Conservation Service and MDC and soil water conservation districts to have programs that encourage landowners to implement these conservation measures like maintaining the riparian corridor. And so most of that funding comes under the Farm Bill. And then the landowners will, they'll have to pay a percentage of it, but then the majority of it is usually paid for by this Farm Bill funding. And so that's one option that we can pursue. But I do know that when you're talking about that large scale of an effort, it is really hard to improve enough habitat to make a functional difference. And so it's happening, but the benefits are usually happen really slowly.
A couple of questions that are, again, semi-related.
Okay.
What is your favorite Missouri River species and why of any taxon? And then what are your favorite and least favorite parts of your job? And what advice would you give to those looking to get into your type of work?
Okay. So like I mentioned a few times, I don't work that extensively on the Missouri River itself. And I will say the reason why Dana selected me to give this presentation is because the person that works on the Missouri River in our office has transferred positions. And so we currently don't have someone that works on the Missouri River. So with that said, if I had to pick a species associated with the Missouri River itself, I'd probably pick the piping clover because they're just so darn cute. And then to answer the other question about, Dana, was it the things I most enjoy and least enjoy about the position?
Exactly.
Okay, so what I would say I most enjoy about the position is number one, building relationships with partners. I find that really fulfilling when we can work together to accomplish things because our agency really doesn't have the funds or the manpower to really do that much alone. And so it's really fulfilling to build those relationships. And I also, it sounds a little corny, but I feel really passionate about actively being involved in the conservation of species. So, you know, you can do that in a variety of ways, via research or, you know, outreach or volunteer efforts. For me, I gravitated towards the regulatory end of things because I felt like I could make a difference in that area by working with project proponents to help, you know, get them to want to conserve listed species. And then I would say the least enjoyable part of my job is somewhat related to that. So when I worked in research, everyone worked really well together and enjoyed working with each other. And then in this position, sometimes you have to tell people things that they don't want to hear. And sometimes they have to implement their projects in a way that they prefer not to. And it costs them more money and it takes them more time. And so sometimes people are unhappy with the recommendations we provide to them. And then sometimes also the public is upset when we list a species because they don't understand how that's going to impact them, or they're scared that, you know, it's going to somehow curtail some of their activities. And so there's certainly some less enjoyable aspects of the job, but, you know, the fulfilling aspects far exceed those. And so if you're interested in getting into an agency like the Fish and Wildlife Service or even the State Wildlife Agency, I would say try to get some kind of internship or volunteer position when you're in high school even, and get your foot in the door to get to give people an opportunity to get to know you and see your work ethic. And then it's also a really good opportunity to see what kind of work you enjoy and gravitate towards.
Thanks, Trisha. And I need to insert that we wanted you to do this because you have incredibly extensive knowledge of the Endangered Species Act and its application in Missouri in general. So we have two more questions if you've got a couple more minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. One is, how do man-made ponds change hydrology that impacts streams and rivers?
Ooh, I don't know, but I can readily answer that one. I do know that, well, I guess the most obvious answer is when you've got a man-made pond, if it's formed through impounding a stream, then that's going to impact the stream both upstream and downstream of that impoundment. You know, I think there could be some additional impacts when you build a pond, or certainly if you build, you know, a lake, that's going to change the surrounding aquifer underneath, or at least the perched water table. And so that can, that can influence the hydrology in the immediate area. But I would say the biggest impacts are going to be if that pond is built by impounding an existing stream.
And finally, Trisha, state local level question here. Jefferson City is planning to build a port authority here. How will that construction / use be examined for T&E impacts, if at all?
Okay, so and I don't know the details of that project, but there would have to be some kind of federal nexus where it would be, whether it receives any kind of federal funding, or if there's a federal agency. I'm not really familiar with port authorities, but if they're impacting the water at all, that's going to require some kind of permit under the Clean Water Act, which is administered by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And so that federal nexus right there is the trigger that requires the federal agency, so it may be the Corps, or it may be another federal agency if there is federal funding. They have to consult with us to evaluate those impacts to listed species. And so in this case, it would be the Pallid Sturgeon. And so I can't speak to exactly what those impacts would be, but they'd be fully evaluated as part of that consultation process. And if the impacts look like they would rise to the level of the terminology that we use in Section 7 consultations is adverse effects. And if it rises to that level, so basically any impact to reproduction or survivorship, then there has to be coverage for those impacts. And that's where we go through that formal consultation process where we, the federal agency has to conduct an in-depth evaluation of the impacts, various conservation measures that can minimize those impacts. And then we develop what we call a biological opinion. And that's what includes an incidental take statement. And that provides take coverage so that the take that would normally be prohibited under the ESA is exempted through that incidental take statement. So it's a very long-winded answer to say that the impacts will be fully evaluated when that action gets going, or planned rather.
We got one more question, and if
Sure.
you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
It's certainly related to all of these things and related to, river recovery, which is how much do you interact with the Army Corps?
A lot. I think I was on the phone with them at least twice today and multiple emails. And so, and that's what I meant before when I said that federal actions are fairly wide reaching. So anytime anyone wants to do anything in stream, most of the time that's going to require a Corps of Engineers permit under 404 of the Clean Water Act. And so we see a lot of Corps actions. So we coordinate with them extensively. We coordinate with them on that level with kind of the smaller actions, but then there's a lot of coordination that happens on the larger level, like when you're talking channelization of segments of the Missouri River, or flood control, levee construction and things like that. Those are what we'd consider to be kind of major federal projects. And so that involves a more intensive level of coordination. And there's actually some additional authorities that we work under, like the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act. So we work with them a lot.
We do not have any more questions, Trisha. I admit that I have like 8 written down from before you even hit your 5th slide. But I won't, I'll be respectful of people's time, but I do want to read something that's actually from one of my board members that's in the chat that I think sums up all of our feelings quite well, which is, thank you for sharing real details about what our Fish and Wildlife Service does or is supposed to do. Your presentation was informative and interesting on so many levels. You are a great representative for this conservation-based government organization. Thank you.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
So we'll go ahead and let everyone go. Have a great evening. my friend, thank you so much. I learned a ton. So
I'm
I
glad.
probably will have questions for you in the future.
You know where to find me.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you.